I'm Eileen Kinsella, and this is Art World Infamy, a podcast miniseries from ArtNet News.
So Jay is Jay Jopling, the founder of London's White Cube, who is best known for his ties to one of the biggest contemporary art scenes of Britain. You know, in the 1990s, the young British artist. Jopling is one of London's most celebrated primary market dealers.
As a young art journalist starting her career in London, Charlotte Burns had first-hand experience with the illustrious gallerist Jay Jopling. To say that he's an art world power player is an understatement. His love of art was cultivated at a young age. As a child, he spent hours at the Tate Museum and visiting churches in Venice with his mother. He actually bought his first artwork when he was just 14, a limited edition copy of Gilbert and George's book titled Dark Shadow, for just £16. It was in the late 1980s in London where he first became friends with the now iconic names of the YBA group, the acronym for Young British Artists. This included a young Damien Hirst and Tracey Emin, who he connected directly with, often socially, and then began hearing out their brazen art ideas and helping them execute them, essentially acting as a manager from the start. From the beginning, Jay managed to pull off a great balancing act, demonstrating both loyalty and support of their bold work, while also imparting his magic touch to their respective markets. He helped secure major patrons early on, while he steadily built up buzz and demand.
Jay Jopling, White Cube.
Are you from London?
How are you doing?
Yeah, we're from London, yeah.
Yeah, well, welcome to New York.
Yes.
You came during the right time of year.
How are you guys? Who are you? Are you Jay
My name's
Jopling?
Walter.
I'm Jay Jopling.
You're Jay
Hi.
Jopling, and you're who?
Tracey, Emin.
Hi, Tracey.
Emin is a classic example of a young artist who both shocked and fascinated viewers with her candid confessional art. When Tracey first met Jay in a London bar, she famously persuaded him to give her £10 in exchange for a series of somewhat shocking confessional letters delivered monthly. She went on to become extraordinarily famous and successful, both from a critical and financial standpoint. Just last year, in 2024, she received a damehood from King Charles for her service to the arts.
I always just thought, you should never let lack of money get in the way of an idea or of, something like that. And then, obviously, when I was a kid, I'd seen Jaws. I thought, why can't we do a big shark? But I just immediately thought it's got to be big enough to eat you, and then in a volume of liquid that would be big enough to frighten you.
In 1991, it was Jay who helped Hirst find the 15-foot tiger shark that would eventually be submerged in formaldehyde and become his famous work with the complex title, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. The shark was quickly sold to mega collector Charles Saatchi for around $100,000, which many regarded as a jaw-dropping price for a wild artwork at the time. A little over 25 years ago, Jay opened the first version of White Cube, a name that was inspired by Brian Doherty's critical essay Inside the White Cube. The gallery started as a small space owned by Christie's on Duke Street. He had somehow persuaded them to let him use it rent-free. Over the course of 2 decades, it grew into a mega gallery with branches in Hong Kong, New York, and Paris. And at one point, there were 3 massive locations in London. Now there's one in Mason's Yard in central London and another in Bermondsey in southeast London. At 58,000 square feet of interior space, the Bermondsey location is one of the largest commercial art galleries in the world. Melanie Gurlis is an art market correspondent for London's Financial Times and also writes a monthly column for the art newspaper. She watched White Cube's ambitious expansion in the mid-aughts and beyond. It was basically in lockstep with the broader growth of the contemporary art market.
White Cube, sort of almost in response, the London stalwart, opened a vast, vast space in Bermondsey. I mean, it's like an aircraft hangar. It's so big. And actually, Bermondsey for White Cube was quite central because they'd been further out in Hoxton before and they had a small space in Mayfair. So the London market was kind of centralising more around these big international hotels in Mayfair.
By the mid-1990s in London, there was a full-blown cultural resurgence. Art, music, and fashion merged to create a scene that many still recall fondly today. At least one of the sparks was lit in 1988 with Damien Hirst's milestone exhibition Freeze. That's Freeze. The Renegade Student Show was organized in an empty building at Surrey Docks. It included fellow YBAs like Angus Fairhurst, Gary Hume, and Sarah Lucas. Freeze created the momentum for the larger and more contentious show, Sensation, which was at the Royal Academy in 1997 and was heavily centered on the YBAs. The English music scene was also thriving. Britpop bands like Oasis and The Verve dominated the airwaves. The Spice Girls were rocketing to fame, and the underground London rave scene was at its peak. The fashion world was introduced to the talents of designers Alexandra McQueen, Phoebe Philo, and Hussein Chalayan. London had become the cool kid of international cities, setting the stage for the next chapter of the art market boom. The now world-famous Frieze Art Fair was first launched in London in 2003, and that's Frieze. It grew out of the eponymous magazine founded by British tastemakers Amanda Sharp and Matthew Sladover. It always seemed like they had their finger on the pulse of art and culture and knew exactly what was going on. So it wasn't surprising when their Frieze Art Fair was an immediate smash hit with the art world.
Frieze was more of an instant hit. It just came straight after all this cool Britannia. Suddenly England had good music. It was kind of edgy, glam. I think Gwyneth Paltrow went in the early days. I'm pretty sure I saw her. It was just at the same time as, in a way, that the banking money that had already been made in New York in the 90s came to London in the early 2000s. We had Tate Modern built, and suddenly contemporary art, cool music, it was all wrapped in the same thing. So Frieze was a bit more of an instant hit. For Frieze, actually, they had to kind of grow up. They had to go from being a fun, people rolling down Paolo Pivi hills in the middle of a tent and people smoking. People were smoking inside the tent at the first Frieze Art Fair. Then you get a few dealers that were like, okay, I really don't want to show my fine works next to people rolling down hills and smoking. So they kind of had to grow up a bit to meet the international art world.
Right at the time the contemporary art market was really taking off in the early aughts, the success of the fair prompted Christie's and Sotheby's to quickly create a flurry of contemporary art-themed auctions. They were taking advantage of the flood of buyers and trendsetters coming to London, and it worked. An entire art season sprung up around this fair as if overnight. Inigo, a young American man, slipped easily into this elite slice of the art world in 2006 with a coveted internship at White Cube. He was also entering the prestigious Goldsmiths College, following in the footsteps of his father, Harry Philbrick, a museum director who was known for his Midas touch. Inigo's careful study of artist markets and attention to detail, including which artists were on the rise and who might be on the decline, was remarkable, and it quickly caught the attention of Jay Jopling. By the time Inigo graduated from college, he had more than proved his market savvy and financial acumen. He was given a role as manager of Jopling's secondary market operation, known as Modern Collections. Even if most of the art world had not yet heard of Inigo, they would definitely recognize and respect Jay Jopling's stamp of approval. Charlotte recounts her first encounter with the very young and very ambitious Inigo Philbrick.
I have a very clear memory of that, actually. It was many, many years ago at a Frieze Art Fair in London. I was working at the art newspaper. I was the US news and art market editor. And I'd come back to London from New York. We were doing the daily newspapers. I was talking to a dealer about a new secondary market gallery that had opened in Mayfair called Modern Collections. And I was mentioning it to a separate dealer that I was talking to at the fair, saying, oh, have you heard about this? And he said, oh, yeah, well, that's actually tied to Jay. And I was like, oh, interesting. It was kind of big news that he was tied to the secondary market gallery.
Secondary market is a term for whatever art business activity happens after a work is sold directly from a gallery show or from the artist to the initial buyer. Depending on how much market demand there is for a particular artist, the price tends to go up on subsequent resales. So, if you were lucky enough to get your hands on a work by Damien Hirst or Tracey Emin for a few £1,000s when White Cube first organized shows of their work, chances are you would make a tidy profit if you held on to that for a while and then eventually resold. It's the art world's version of the old stock market adage, buy and hold. It can be a lucrative universe for savvy pickers, but not necessarily for the artist in question, who typically doesn't benefit from or have any real connection or control over resales that happen further down the line.
So this is 2011, so Frieze Masters hasn't even opened yet. It opened the following year. So Frieze is still very much a primary market fair, which means that all the dealers there are very much about supporting artists directly. The secondary market is when you're selling works without the artist being involved, which artists don't always like because they're not involved in the deal. They don't know where the works are going. They don't get a cut of the sale. And usually works sell for a lot more on the secondary market, and the artists don't get a cut of any of that profit. So it can be more controversial from the artist point of view. And if you are a dealer who's really making your reputation as a primary market gallery, as someone really invested in supporting artists in that direct way, it can be a little more controversial, depending on how you manage your relationships with your artists. So it was news for a journalist, day whatever it was, of the daily newspapers. I was thrilled. So I spoke to my editors and was like, I have some news. Jay's involved in this new Mayfair Gallery Modern Collections. They were like, great, go to the gallery, go find out. So I hop on the tube, get across to Mayfair, go into the gallery, and I see this kind of skinny guy, Inigo Philbrick. And I was like, hi, I'm Charlotte Burns. I'm here to see this show. It was a Wade Guyton and Kelly Walker show. Both of them were artists that weren't represented by White Cube or Modern Collections. And they were both artists who were very much in demand on the market. Both of their prices were high at that time. Their works were selling way over primary market prices on the secondary market.
It's important to note that the high asking prices on the secondary market were crucial to Modern Collections and thus Inigo's operation. The business model was basically a bet that collector demand was so intense that it would support the much higher asking prices.
I quoted a collector in an article I wrote who said that works that were around $20,000 6 or 7 years before were now around $800,000 on the secondary market. So these were really hot artists. They're in this Mayfair show, and there's this guy I'd never seen before, and he was like a skinny, pale-looking guy, maybe even a few little spots, looked a little awkward, and a nice enough guy, like friendly. And I was like, I said I was with the art newspaper. I said I was writing about the opening of the show. He was telling me a lot about the works. He was kind of academic, a little nerdy, if anything. And then I said, am I correct that Jay Jopling is involved in this, that he has a stake in the business? Because that was the part that wasn't being publicly announced. And then he was like, and he was slightly awkward and nervous about it. So I was like, great, I've got a great story. He seemed so young. And he was, I think, the former head of secondary market sales at White Cube. And it was just a curious thing because it was like Jay was one of London's biggest dealers. He wasn't being public about the fact that this was a gallery he had a stake in. So it was news.
Charlotte's story raised the question of whether galleries were breaching hidden codes of conduct by reselling works by their younger artists at far inflated prices to satisfy intense demand. Melanie, who was working with Charlotte at the time, recalled that the article garnered quite a bit of attention because it addressed the very real issue that such fast rising prices could be unsustainable or worse, disastrous for the artist in question.
I remember working on daily newspapers during the Frieze Art Fair in 2012 when one of my colleagues, Charlotte Burns, got the news basically that Inigo was going to head this new secondary market gallery run through White Cube in which Jay Jopling and White Cube were investing. And she wrote a big feature that was called Too Much Too Young. She was writing about artists who were selling too quickly on the secondary market, young artists who were selling much quicker than they had done in the past.
And of course, in addition to the primary question of money, you have optics to consider. Here is one of London's biggest art dealers suddenly backing a dedicated secondary market gallery and quietly putting someone so young and still relatively unknown in charge.
My editor was like, great story, go and beef it up, go around talking to people at the fair. And so I did. I got some details on the pricing. Plus, they're really interesting artists. Like Wade Guyton specifically is an artist who really tries to mess with his own market as well and continue to do so. It's not like when Jay just opened in New York, there was a whole big media strategy around having a lot of media attention. They decided to do this very quietly and have someone that wasn't in the art world. No one really knew who Inigo was. That was kind of the point of it. And so Jay did it quietly on purpose, I guess, because it was a different way of doing something. It was a secondary market gallery owned by a very prominent primary market dealer. All the big primary market dealers do secondary market sales, but they don't necessarily open a secondary market gallery totally separately of artists that aren't theirs, that they don't represent, because it's so aggressive.
Speaking of aggressive, Inigo was just that, constantly making suggestions to Jay from the start about which works he should prune from his holdings and sell off in hopes of targeting better, more lucrative opportunities. It explains, at least in part, Inigo's extreme emphasis and focus on secondary market works. Charlotte explains why, in some ways, it made sense for dealers to become more deeply involved in secondary market trading.
But in fairness to the dealers, it's an existential threat. If you are building an artist's career and you are putting all this effort in and you're a mom and pop shop, essentially, or you get backing or however you do it. But if you're a dealer, you are taking a risk on your artist. And everybody talks about the artists who hit it big. They're the ones who make it. But they don't talk about all the other artists in your stable who don't, or they take a long time. And they're the ones who get the critical attention. And they're the ones who might make it into the biennales, but they're not the ones who are really keeping the gallery going. So you're going to have a few stars, and they're the ones that the collectors are going to focus on. But your stable of artists aren't all going to be big financial hitters. And you have to support the whole gallery and production, and the production budgets for everything have increased. And as we've gone through this boom period, there have been more fairs, there have been more biennales, there have been more events. Everybody's been doing more. And it was like fatigue became this thing. People started talking about how much they were doing. And so the amount of work people have been doing just to keep up, the amount of work artists have been doing, producing, it's been production heavy. If you think of 2011 to now, in the amount of work, it's kind of been this glut and gluttony as people have been trying to attract, there's been more sales, more auctions, more countries coming in, more new buyers, this sense of almost frenzied expansion. You had to have unlimited, our Basel's been called unlimited, this sense of infinite potential growth. And you have to be there, and you have to be making the money, and you have to be selling. Because if you don't, your slot's not going to be there next year. If your artist gets into a biennale, you have to go, and you have to go and spend all the crazy money going to Venice at that time of year, putting up all your staff, shipping whatever you're going to ship through a flooded city. The cost of doing business, if you're a dealer, supporting your artists, is insane. The dealers are doing all of that. And then if they're selling works for primary artists for like $20,000, then on the secondary market, it's going for $800,000. You are going to think, okay, I need to do something about that. And at that point, it was a few years later, in this recent period, immediately it's been selling, it's been being flipped. And so the dealers have been having to think, like, how do you cope with that? How do you protect your artist? How do you figure out who to sell to? And if you're a collector, you have to think about how to deal with that. Because if you bought a work, maybe you really meant to keep that forever, but then all of a sudden, that's like your entire kid's college fund. What do you do? And so the injection of capital, that enormous amount of money into the system, it just changes the way that everybody behaves, including the artists. And so what do you do when that much money goes into a system? It changes everything.
Of course, as more money was pouring into the market, it attracted the attention of profit seekers who didn't necessarily know or care about art. They might have a lot of capital, but not necessarily access to or even affinity for the art. That's where Inigo came in. And though it wasn't immediately obvious to those he was advising, he was painting wildly different pictures of the worth of a work, or how much a respective investor owned. His story was based on who they were and what he thought they might want to hear. But not everyone was impressed with Inigo, including art advisor Todd Levitt.
The word that kept coming up most often in the Philbrick description was charm. It wasn't integrity or honesty or trustworthiness or loyalty or discretion or intelligence or experience or expertise. Oh, and edge. edge came up too. He's got about as much edge as Mr. Rogers.
Others, like art advisor Ben Godsill, saw something else. For someone so young and new on the scene, he seemed to always be in the most exclusive spots and always wearing the right clothes.
He seemed cool. He showed up in all the right places. He was wearing the right suits. He always looked kind of dashing and super Euro in a way, even though he's American. So he had this kind of Euro chicness about him, a la Stad guy or something like that. He seemed fun, like he stayed out late, like I did at the time. He seemed like a good guy and showed in his gallery in London and was active in the rooms with a number of artists that I also found to be important. I was a little bit jealous, right? I thought he was doing cool secondary market shows of not older blue chip artists, but what we could term emerging blue chip artists. People like Wade Guyton, for instance. And so I thought it was like a really smart business model. I was a little jealous that he had found a way to have a physical space where he was able to broker deals as well as do shows kind of contextualizing these artists.
It wasn't just his social connections, style, and affinity for the finer things in life. Inigo's apparent market savvy and seeming ability to spin gold and rake in profits on the secondary market was also catching the art world's eye, including art market reporters. To Melanie, Inigo represented a new generation of art buyers.
He reached out to me through a middle person in 2018, so late, sort of 6 years ago. And he was keen to tell me about a venture he was starting in Miami, but he wanted to talk to me. So we met for coffee. A few things struck me about him. I mean, he was very young to be in this position of, he was very involved in guarantees at auction, selling things via auction, buying things at auction at really, really quite high levels. He loved talking about prices. He loved talking about the market and about value. Certainly keen to tell me of artists that I now know he was very invested in that he thought were undervalued. He was keen to get prices a bit better for Marc Grotjean and Taba Auerbach and some of the artists in George Condo that he was in and out of. But he was also charming, seemed great fun, and he had this transatlantic accent. He seemed from the new, exciting art market.
From his earliest days at White Cube, Inigo had an intense knack for knowing where key artworks were located and how and when to pry them loose from respective collectors for a possible sale. After just a few years at White Cube, his wheeling and dealing had proved so lucrative that one reference described him as a standout performer and an art trader who single-handedly was generating 10 times the profits of the gallery's sprawling 150-member team. The gallery had even hired a new consultant whose main role was to keep him there in golden handcuffs if necessary. One of Inigo's strategies was to focus in on particular artists and their respective markets, diving deep into research in hopes of taking advantage of rising demand and interest. That had been the idea for the inaugural show of Wade Guyton and Kelly Walker, where asking prices reflected a sharp increase. And as Charlotte notes, this was an effective approach.
By concentrating on a few artists, you become the go-to person for a few artists. Not the go-to, because there are a lot of people trading these artists, but you become someone in the mix of these names. And he was making a lot of money and people were going to him, especially people who wanted to trade. And there's a lot of people at that time when there were a lot of trades happening. There was a lot of money in the market and there wasn't necessarily as much diligence going on because there was just so much money in the market. People were moving very fast.
Between his stylish appearance and ability to persuade, people, including Melanie, could easily believe why even seasoned collectors might be willing to hand over 6- and 7-figure amounts to someone so young.
He was impeccably dressed, really quite charming. You could see how he could win over a potential seller or buyer and everyone else in between. He took me for a very, very, very nice lunch, really generous. And then he took me to show me his gallery. And while we were there, I just remember that he was very, very proud to have a cushion on the sofa in this space that he had stolen or pinched, if you like, from the place where we just had lunch. Not that day, but another day. He's like, oh, look at this, look at this. At the time, I thought, why would someone with so much going for him and so much need the buzz of nicking a restaurant cushion? There was just always something a little bit on the edge about that.
A huge part of Inigo's success was based on access to major artists like Gilbert and George, and building trust with high-profile collectors such as Daniel Temple and Loretta Wurtenberger, a.k.a. Fine Art Partners, a.k.a. FAP. Inigo was also involved in deals with Belgian collector Bert Kroik and managed an art investment fund for Israeli-Canadian billionaire Mark Steinberg. The very fact that he was actively buying and selling for so many ultra-wealthy collectors not only meant non-traditional buying and selling agreements, it also allowed him to have much easier access to capital. They trusted the stories he told or seemingly demonstrated about profits. He was also beginning to display many of the outward trappings of success, from splurges at restaurants and travel on private jets, to bespoke suits and pricey watches. These were on display at the elite Christie's, Sotheby's, and Phillips night auctions. Charlotte and I have often joked about how we were always standing near one another during the evening auctions, straining our necks to report on the action and try to see who is bidding on what, all the while clutching our catalogs and taking notes while gathered in the designated press pen in the auction sale rooms. Art journalists typically cluster in a spot on the side or the back of the room. Collectors and auction attendees are clearly seated according to a hierarchy that reflects activity and importance in the market. For all the years we've both been covering major sales, we agree that the seating chart of the rooms changes either not at all or minimally at best.
The thing that happens in the room is that the room is relatively unchanging. If you stand where the journalists stand, which is top front in one of the auction houses, back left in one of the other auction houses, you're always in the same place, and basically the same people are sitting in the same seats for those 15 years. There's a little bit of change. There was a moment when there were like new buyers from China, and then they had a few seats further at the front. There was a moment there was like Russian buyers, and they had seats, and then they all left. So there's a little bit of turnover in like the new buyers, but essentially like the big collecting families have the same seats. The dealers have the same kind of seats. They move up and down depending on like which artists are in the sale, who's going to bid, and the auction houses do a very orchestrated job. It's like very choreographed dinner party, essentially. But what's amazing is that it fundamentally doesn't really change. And because people are so well coiffed and manicured themselves, they don't fundamentally change. People don't really age in that room because, you know, people pay a lot not to age that much. And so when you read stories about how like it was such a surprise to everybody and everyone was so shocked, I always find that quite funny because Inigo was one of the few people in an auction room who definitely changed. He went from being this sort of nerdy, awkward person, kind of academic and uncomfortable in his own body, in the way he held himself and the way he moved in those rooms, which are powerful rooms full of very confident, very wealthy people, and can be very overwhelming when you walk into them. He became someone who became extremely confident. And, you know, I remember walking up behind him one evening into a Phillips auction, and he had the patina on his skin of someone who had come off a party into the auction house. That auction was starting at about 5:45. And so I thought, oh, you know, Inigo's changed. If he looked like someone who'd come from the library in 2011, he looked like someone who'd come from a heavy dinner. And so I was just like, wow, Inigo's looking really different. And his whole vibe, you know, his arms are on the back of the chair. He was sort of man-spreading. He was very confident about posting his arms with his paddles. He and Kenny sat next to each other in every sale, and they were just having a great time. He was very confident about taking up space, and his whole persona shifted. He became a player, and he had arrived, and he moved forward in the room from someone who was like very much in the further reaches, was in the back of the room. He got moved further forward in the room, and he was much, much more confident, much more aggressive in his bidding. And, you know, his suits became nicer, his shirts got lower, his hair got higher. In a sea of relatively unchanging faces, Inigo was a face that changed. And so he definitely was making money, and he was kind of flashy about it. You know, most people in that room, they sat in the same seats and they did the same thing for 10 years. When I first spoke to people about who's this guy that Jay's brought in to run his gallery, everyone was like, oh, he's kind of really nerdy. He's really academic. He's kind of intellectual. He was not, oh, he's some big flashy dealer type. You know, he'd sell his grandma. He was not that guy. And there's lots of those guys in the market. He was not. He was really seen as a researcher guy. And then by the end, he was a money guy. He'd sell anyone.
Inigo's rise also coincided with the increasing use of speculative financial tools in the art market. These included fractional ownership, or stepping up as a backer or guarantor, to assume the risk when a work was offered at auction. The idea there is that an auction house finds someone, a guarantor, who agrees to buy an artwork at a set price. That ensures it doesn't go unsold. That unfortunate scenario, where a work fails to sell, is referred to as a buy-in, or more casually, as a flop. And when it happens in a public forum like an auction, it can mean serious reputational damage. The negative buzz can mean a sort of black mark that will hurt a work for potential sales, lasting well into the future. While such guarantee deals were nothing new, the rate and speed with which Inigo was embracing them and drawing in others was already accelerating to a troubling degree.
I mean, the financialization, you have to understand, goes way back to the 1980s, to be sure. And there's antecedents that are decades before that. But it was really in the late 80s when I was coming of age as an advisor, sort of starting out and cutting my teeth, that there was this market translation of culture into a consumer product, or what people called at the time the commodification of culture. That was the term that was thrown around for the first time. And that meant that creativity didn't flourish as a restricted cultural product anymore, but it was turning symbolic art into a very real and highly decided commodity. And some of that transformation does later manifest itself now as this extension of our what we call the current experience economy, which is this ad hoc mixture of Hollywood, Wall Street, and social media. But there was already in the 80s this sort of professionalization beginning of the cultural production system. So there's nothing new to any of this, really.
At some point, a shift occurred and money came flooding into the art market. I saw that it really started to gather momentum in the mid-aughts, around 2005 or so. But a severe downturn finally caught up with the art market in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. Some call it the wealth lag effect. A few years later, thanks to a little help from the government, it was off to the races again.
I suppose I can say two things, one general and one specific to the matter at hand. The general thing is, yes, in the, quote, this great depressionary period of late 07 going into 08 and 09, so on and so forth, there was this tremendous amount in a number of rounds of QE that was offered by the government, fundamentally because credit had seized up completely.
QE is a reference to quantitative easing. It involves the introduction of new infusions of cash into the money supply by a central bank, and the U.S. government did it multiple times in the wake of the 2008 crisis.
And without lubricating the system, if you don't have the credit, the system can collapse. The system is fundamentally based on credit. People trade back and forth with each other and give each other credit. If you don't have that, our system fundamentally will collapse. And so the QE at its most base level was offered to lubricate that system of credit. It's just that they printed money like there was no tomorrow at the time. And you could see that happening. You could see the tap turning on, and you knew the money was going to go into the system. And if past performance is an indicator of future behavior, you knew that most of that money, though meant to trickle down to everybody, was probably going to be bottlenecked in the hands of a smaller group of people who were already pretty high net worth. And they were going to need to find a place to put all that excess capital to work. They're not going to obviously stuff cash in their mattress. So they were going to start spending it and investing it in things that they thought would get them the best possible return. And for better or worse, art was one of those assets, if you want to refer to it as an asset, which I don't like to, but for the purpose of this discussion, we will, that these ultra high net worth individuals who had this excess amount of excess capital had decided would be a good place. So that kind of set up the snapback, which was only really 18 months, surprisingly short. I was even surprised that it was that quick. And by 2011, the art market, I can't speak to all the markets, but the art market was already sort of fully juiced again and off and running, largely.
Even from a glance at the frothy prices and overall market volume that ensued following the 2008 crash, it was clear to art journalist Judd Tully that money was flooding into the contemporary art market.
The recession, the worldwide collapse in 2008, and then it took a couple of years for the art market to regain its legs. Everything is cyclical, and I think that once the money started coming back in the financial markets, and wealth was building again, and people were sort of hungry for something fun to do and something to get connected to again. I think contemporary art was like the perfect platform for that. And the growth of the art fairs all around the world and the constant traveling, going back between, Seoul and New York and Paris and London and Basel, created a kind of hunger, and things were selling easily, and you weren't hearing about galleries closing or auction houses laying off people. It was a sort of a moment. And then I think also things changed maybe more recently, and there was another little mini boom with collectors trying to sort of switch over and to buy works of artists of color. And the younger, the faster, that also became frothy, very frothy. And I think that too could have also fizzed over and be over by now. But in terms of the time that Inigo was operating was a perfect time for someone like that, where there was a lot of demand and there was relatively little supply of those top-tier, sought-after artists. And I think he played in that little window, very effectively.
It was a perfect storm. The market conditions, combined with Inigo's savvy and access to wealth, allowed him to thrive.
Now, that's the general backdrop. Having said that, it's really important to understand that Philbrick really started coming up in that period. So this isn't somebody who has a tremendous amount of experience having gone through market corrections repeatedly. He became successful in this secondary market environment, not because of some Svengali, crystal ball Nostradamus-like ability to predict future market behavior with greater vision than anyone else, but rather because any 5-year-old child or reasonably bright golden retriever would have been successful in the secondary market at that time, given the ebulliently frothy market conditions that QE2, and 3 and 4 allowed and offered to almost anyone to successfully flip art in that context. And this was what was sort of surprising reading about this after the fact, is that people talked about him like he was some kind of wunderkind. But the real tale of the tape would be seeing him successfully flip secondary market artworks with the same alacrity now in the current market conditions that have seized up completely for his chosen market darlings at that time. Because the real measure of a dealer or a flipper, whatever you want to call him, occurs precisely when the markets suddenly stop or severely reverses. Lots of guys watch Bruce Lee movies. Doesn't mean that they can do karate.
If you're purely treating the artwork as an investment or asset that you're betting will increase in value and not buying it to hang on your wall, you're taking a risk. You might lose money if the resale doesn't garner a profit. At worst, you might be out all of your money if the person who solicited your investment lied about even owning the artwork. And along with the increasing use of loose financial arrangements, as Charlotte observed, dealers were also faced with tough choices about expanding their business.
You can hear the dealers in this article thinking about it. What do? You have to innovate. You have to keep up. Do you spend money? Is now the time to expand? Is now the time to save? Is now the time to open another gallery? Is now the time to raise prices, to take on new artists? The business is changing all around them. And the next year, Frieze would open Frieze Masters and expand into New York. You're at the beginning of that moment where it's all about to really grow. After that, you're going to get more fairs in Asia. You're going to get more fairs in America. You're just going into this huge period. The auction houses are totally about to shift in their business models. You're going to get Tad Smith coming into Sotheby's, total shift there before the private ownership. So the way that business is going to be done in the art world from this period on is about to shift massively. And Inigo is like one person who his kind of character arc shifts enormously with that growth.
While there's nothing new to the aspect of speculating on expensive art, hoping to make a profit, the increased number of deals were taking place in a frothy, ascending contemporary art market, and as Ben Godsill observes, more opportunities for bad behavior.
Cons always prey on the greed. And I think in a frothy market, when people see other money being made, they want to participate in that. I'm certainly can be, in any facet of my life, somehow attracted to that. And I think that's typical of the human condition. You see others being successful. You want to get some of that for yourself. And you also want to attach yourself to a star, someone that's seen as rising. And I think, there's more than just the money. There's like so much subtle psychology at play here and how people get taken in by someone like this and lose money. It's interesting, so you see, this was at the highest level. These are people that were already in the market. These were no one that was, from what I understand, that was new to the art market. I'm interested in, we see kind of now fractionalization of paintings where they're sold to people that might not be as sophisticated in the market. And I'm wondering if that opens up to even more potential fraud down the line in different sorts of contexts.
In 2016, Inigo opened his own secondary market venture in London called, what else? Inigo Philbrick Limited. 6 years later, Inigo decided to expand with a new space in Miami, Florida, where the major annual Art Basel Miami Beach Fair takes place each December. One of the first shows he organized there was of Austrian art star Franz West, alongside one of his other favorite artists, Rudolf Stingel. Despite the expansion, which many in the area welcomed and saw as a sign of continued success, cracks were beginning to show. Inigo's relationship with fine art partners was becoming increasingly strained. After 4 months, the proceeds of the Stingel Picasso auctioned at Christie's had still not been paid out to them, and there were several other major multi-million-dollar deals that Inigo had not made good on, including another Stingel that had been auctioned more than a year previously. Former staffers saw the increasing toll that the pressure was putting on Inigo. Aware that a lawsuit over unpaid funds might be in the offing, they were instructed by Inigo and his director to stay away from the gallery most days, under the guise that he was away at quote-unquote important meetings. In early October, a court-appointed server handed over a $13 million breach of contract suit to an unwitting gallery staffer. It hit like a bombshell. It detailed a deep pattern of deceit and theft over the course of the deals executed in the previous 2 years. Around the time that his first legal response was due, Inigo hopped on a plane and left the U.S. for good, leaving behind a shuttered, empty gallery space and a fast-growing pileup of legal claims. Art World Infamy is produced by Sonia Manalili. To stay on top of what happens in this saga, join us next week for a new episode. And if you would like to hear more stories and analysis from across the art world, subscribe to The Art Angle on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for listening.